Chairman, you have held half of my speech, actually. Oh, no. But I'll try to add a few things. Federal Councillor Doris Leuthard, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished participants and guests. The vast majority of scientists agree that climate change we are witnessing is caused by human action. And as Doris Leuthard just said, global warming is a fact. The predictions of its consequences by the end of the century look devastating if business as usual prevails. Even the climate target, as it was agreed at the International Climate Conference in Cancun in December 2010, that is limiting global warming to below 2 degrees centigrade, carries enormous risks to biodiversity, infrastructure, and human well-being in general. WWF is determined to do all it possibly can to fight this threat, which includes technical solutions, consumer information, cooperation with business, and pushing for an adequate legislative framework on local, national, and global level. Without a major success in this endeavor, we endanger big parts of the nature conservation work of the last 50 years. We put at risk the high standard of living we have achieved over the centuries in the Western world, and it is at the same time the standard of living the emerging and the developing countries are striving for with so much determination today. In 1992, in the atmosphere of the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, a coalition of 30 Swiss NGOs, among them WWF, distributed footprint questionnaires to about 700,000 Swiss households. The initial questionnaire had been developed to assess both energy use and greenhouse gas emissions caused by the specific lifestyle of the individual in question. However, we finally only used the version which comprised the energy accounting, leaving aside the carbon footprinting. A majority of the NGOs taking part in the exercise took the view that carbon footprinting was much too far away from what regular citizens were ready and able to deal with at that time. Fortunately, we have come a far way since. To a large extent, thanks to your endeavors as carbon footprint leaders, many more societal and political players know that ecological footprinting and environmental life cycle assessments are essential both for supporting decisions and monitoring success. Let's be grateful that recently these techniques and the indicators to work with have become more widely known, enjoy more acceptance and even popularity in some quarters. Carbon footprinting helped to get the first life cycle-based labels onto products, and it helped in a decisive way to make a large number of companies more aware of their supply chain impacts and the true footprint their products have in the natural environment. Carbon footprinting has some obvious advantages over life cycle assessments and general ecological footprinting. It is narrower in scope, which makes it both easier to assess facts precisely and to communicate the results. In addition, it is one of the answers to a more recent threat, the cases in which classical environmental law has no answer so far, in which end-of-pipe technologies such as filters are rarely the solution we need. However, carbon footprinting also has its limits. WWF believes that wherever possible, we should strive for more comprehensive approaches that take into account the greatest possible number of potential risks. It would be wrong to mitigate one risk by augmenting another. The tragic events in Japan are the most recent example for this danger. In the aftermath, tendencies have grown strongly in the public debates to, quote-unquote, solve the nuclear problem, or rather the problem of a full electricity provision without the nuclear option, by starting to make important concessions in fighting climate change or in water and biodiversity protection. An example for the limitations of carbon footprinting is its application to the question of biofuels. Advocates of biofuels have used carbon footprints for almost 20 years to prove the superiority of biofuels over petrol. Many countries offered subsidies or tax breaks to promote biofuels. Switzerland came late into this race for alternative fuels and realized, based on life cycle assessment studies, that carbon cuts of this kind may come at huge environmental costs in other areas. As a consequence, the new law requires a standardized life cycle assessment study in order to profit from tax cuts. The minimum requirements are set in such a way that only biofuels from organic waste and only the most benign agri-fuels can pass the test. Although this legislation proved to be rather successful in avoiding biofuels that impact the environment more than petrol does, further rules are currently being added to the system in order to deal with food security and the indirect use of land. It will be important for the EU and the US to follow suit and strengthen biofuel rules in order to trigger the development of second and third generation technologies in this field. With this example, we switch from voluntary and for information-only instruments to the use of footprinting in legislation. At WWF, we believe we are now ready to enter a stage where official regulations and standards on the one side and incentives for appropriate individual behavior on the other side need to go hand in hand in order to mainstream the concept and pave the way for measurable action. In the debate about the Swiss law on CO2 reduction, Parliament, which is underway right now, Parliament may agree this summer to allow companies, if they wish, to use carbon savings in the supply chain or improved product performance to fulfill the conditions that are necessary to be exempted from the carbon tax. Such a system is tried and tested and brings considerable potential for emission reductions. It has been common practice in the Netherlands for a number of years and has contributed considerably to that country's leadership in eco-design. Recent studies by the Swiss MEM, the Swiss Association of the Metal and Machinery Industry, together with the Swiss Energy and Environmental Agencies, show that engineers in its member companies are well aware of the opportunities to reduce the electricity consumption of their prestigious machines, which go to a large extent into export. They estimate that improving the efficiency of the machines only with measures now already known to the member companies would result in a reduction of CO2 emissions by roughly 10 million tons per year, or that would be 20% of the Swiss domestic emissions. It is easy to imagine that if such an analysis would be extended to all sectors of the economy, a vastly greater potential would emerge. Therefore, WWF calls upon politicians and business leaders to systematically apply the tools you as carbon footprint leaders developed and to base their decisions on the results they yield. WWF Switzerland partners with a dozen of important and mostly big companies within its WWF Climate Group. Initially, the focus of the agreements between the individual company and us was on housekeeping, so to speak. That is, reducing emissions in their facilities and in their transport system. However, not only in the case of the three big retailers, Migros, Coop, and IKEA, but also in the case of most other companies, the major contribution to their ecological footprint comes with their upstream and downstream processes. This is particularly true for Switzerland, where the per capita net greenhouse gas emissions from trade equal about the domestic emissions. Together with the companies, we are now developing measures that allow them to minimize impacts along the full life cycle of their products and services. Due to so far little control over emissions in the supply chain, there are many challenges ahead, both in the voluntary cooperation we do with companies as well as in the involvement of legislation. Unfortunately, a combination of different interest groups has recently been able to downbeat a new car and energy efficiency label proposed by the Swiss government. Otherwise, Switzerland would have introduced a compulsory car label that not only includes information on energy use and CO2 emissions, as the now agreed version does, but also relevant information on environmental life cycle impacts. With this example, I would like to illustrate the fact that your PCF initiative and the congresses you hold are both necessary and highly welcome on our common way forward to an industrial production with much less environmental impact and therefore a much safer, both ecologically and economically speaking, more promising future. I'm sure all of us present here want to see more drive and more movement in the attempt to turn the knowledge of a few experts into the action of many. The way to really satisfactory results is certainly still stony and long. I thank you wholeheartedly for the important contributions you have made in the past and you will certainly make in the future to do away with these obstacles. Steadily, determinedly, and as quickly as possible. May your conference here in Rüschlikon, Switzerland, become an important milestone on this route. I wish you the best of success in your deliberations in the 2 days which are coming up. Thank you very much for your attention.